Beowulf by Neil Foster MacPhail. Read by Mike Moore. Book 1. Beowulf and the Monster Grendel. Chapter 1. What the Coast Guard Saw. The steady wind coming in from the sea had a chill running through it. The guard, whose job it was to guard the coastline, had been walking up and down the cliffs by the beach for hours now, and the lambent glow of dawn over the trees was still an hour or two away. The moon was half full, and shone whitely over the waves, making a flickering path from the horizon to the shore. The guard's face was toward the sea, and his back was to Heorot, the mighty mead hall of King Hrothgar of Denmark. Then, as now, mead halls were built for people to drink and eat and dance and sing in. The old stories were told, and kings awarded land and treasure to their most worthy thanes. Heorot was by far the largest mead hall anyone had ever heard of, until it burned down. At the time of this story, it is not burned down yet. On this night, the hall was dark, silent, and empty. The hall had not been used for more than 10 years, and there was a very good reason for that. At first, the guard wasn't sure, but after he'd watched for a while, he detected a dark mote floating in the middle of the silvery ribbon of moonlight. After he'd watched a bit longer, he knew it was no whale or walrus, but a boat heading his way. So much for waiting for the dawn and returning to wife and bed. As he waited to see if the boat was going to land on the Danish coast or sail on by, the coast guard stopped his pacing along the cliffs and simply waited, leaning on his tall ash spear and keeping his ears open for anything happening to the right or left of him. Over the rhythmic sound of the surf and the steady wind, he could hear low voices talking, as well as the many small creaking, splashing, and thumping sounds that oars make. Knowing if he blew his horn to sound the alarm, armed men would come running, the guard waited. After a long while, he heard heavy splashing sounds. Voices came over the air from nearby, along with metallic clinks and the thump of wooden shields and bundles of spears being tossed onto the rocky bank where the boat was now moored. He heard a low, solemn voice giving a brief prayer, no doubt one of thanks to the seas for being calm. He heard the snorting of horses and the clumping of their hooves, and soon enough they climbed up the stony escarpment and came into view. There had been horses on the ship? Iron-tipped lances were held high, as no fewer than 14 mail-clad warriors with iron helmets rode toward him. They had a large banner on a pole. Some of them had swords as well, in case anyone somehow got in too close to kill with the lances or a thrown spear. He was watching those swords to see if any came out of its sheath, and those spears to see if any of them lowered threateningly. They did not. He called out, "Who are you men, crossing the sea in your tall ship and disembarking in chainmail corselets and iron helmets? Whose great banner is this? I am the warden this night, keeping watch for enemies. I have never before seen such fierce, well-equipped warriors on my strip of beachfront. I hope you have not come as spies on your way to invade the lands of the Scyldings. I need to know where you are from, and quickly." "Good night to you," a warm rumbling voice came back to him, with only slightly accented Danish. The speaker was a huge bear of a man, with a thick mane of wavy reddish-brown hair, and a thick beard under his plumed iron helmet. He was tall, but he was not slender or graceful. The horse he sat upon was dark and large. The warrior was not fat, but he was very thick, even taking into account his heavy chainmail shirt, which protected him from neck to knees. On a wide belt, he wore a sheath, which held an unusually thick and large sword. His calves were bare and hairy above rough leather boots. His hands were very large and strong, gnarled and knotted. His dark, deep-set eyes twinkled under arched, bushy brows. "Well, I suppose it's not good morning quite yet, but it seems a bit late to wish you a good night." "We have not had a good night in Heorot for over 10 years now," the guard of the coast told the enormous warrior. "So I have heard," said the imposing figure. "In fact, that is why I have come. We are from the house of King Hygelac of the Geats, and we have come to offer to lend a hand to you in your difficulty." He produced the word Geats in the manner of his people, and it sounded more like Yeats. "Are you suggesting that we Speardanes cannot handle our own difficulties?" the Coast Guard grated out. "I meant no offense," replied the Yet, in a manner of a man who frequently gives offense without meaning to. "Do you think we have no skilled swordsmen in Denmark?" the guard asked. "I am sure you have skilled swordsmen in Denmark," the warrior, whose name was Beowulf, agreed. "King Hrothgar was himself a fierce warrior in his day, and his loyal thane Unferth has acquainted many with his bright blade Hrunting to their hurt," the guard continued, perhaps a bit defensively. "Unferth? Isn't he the one who—" "Yes, Unferth. And Unferth is a mighty warrior and faithful thane of King Hrothgar," said the guard. If he had warmed up to them at all, this last comment had made his voice chilly again. The newly arrived Yet had touched upon a sore point. "Of course, I do not mean to suggest otherwise," the warrior said, lowering his head and ploughing on in the discussion. "But am I right in thinking Heorot is still a hall far too dangerous in which to celebrate?" "You are right." "And have Hrothgar or Unferth and the other thanes found a solution to your difficulty?" "They have not." The last was said a bit grudgingly. The wind continued to increase in speed, starting to hiss through the cedar trees atop the cliffs. The spreading glow of dawn had begun in the sky behind the trees. "Fixing a problem such as this one is far easier said than done. Are you a deft swordsman at least?" the guard asked, after a bit. "Formidable, more than deft," the thick warrior admitted. "You do look formidable at that," the guard replied. "Well, men from the house of Higelac of the Yeats," he said, pronouncing the names as best he could and overdoing it a bit. He clunked the butt end of his spear against the ground beside his boot with a formal air. "You shall pass," he announced, finally. He was a man who took his job very seriously. And 14 armed warriors rode past him up the cliffs and into the cedar trees beyond which King Hrothgar's great horned hall Heorot sat dark and empty. As for the guard, he resumed pacing the paths by the cliffs, waiting until the sun came up fully over the trees, and he could return to wife and bed. Chapter 2. Young Beowulf Goes Swimming. As you know well, my sister's son, the story of Beowulf has been told for nearly a century now, and by many men, each imagining it in his own way. It is rather a fad at this point, and no doubt it will soon be forgotten once people tire of it. No one is in any great hurry to write down a version of it, and if they do, who knows what version it will be. If there is one thing men cannot ever learn to do, it is agree about much of anything. So I really doubt if this story will be written down on paper anytime soon. How some men tell it, Beowulf was the offspring of a she-bear and a human man. The man is said to have been named Egtheow, or perhaps this was just a good nickname for a skilled swordsman, and not the name his mother gave him. Because of being half-bear, they say, the child Beowulf's hands were strong and clumsy like paws, and he swam and fought nearly as mightily as a young bear would have. Beowulf grew to be a stocky bear man, they say, and when he rejoined human society, he had a mighty thirst for mead. Mead, as you know, is the alcoholic drink your father's sister makes from honey. Beowulf is said to have been a famously mighty swimmer and fighter. It is related that he had trouble navigating the deep waters of human social settings, however. One thing we do know is that when fighting, Beowulf often broke or dropped his swords and settled matters bare-handed instead. On that, everyone agrees. When many of the rest of us tell the story, though, we imagine that Beowulf was simply born a human child to a human woman who died near a forest, and that for 7 winters he was raised by a great shaggy she-bear who suckled him like she would one of her own cubs. Until he was old enough to walk, he rode around on the great bear in the daytime, clinging to her thick pelt with his strong little fingers. At night he slept, curled up against her warm, furry belly, her breath pouring over him like a soft blanket. The great beast taught him how to swim and fish and hunt and fight in the icy rivers and pools where they lived. She couldn't teach her little foster son which fork to use, nor which end of the sword to hold, nor the politest way to say something delicate, however. And so when he rejoined human company, we relate, those things came to him very slowly. This much is known about Beowulf. Many things go without saying, and so I need not spend time in relating them again. Everyone knows of impulsive Heathalath, talkative swirting of the cracked cup, all the stolid and endlessly discussed kings of the Speardanes, the famously savage Eorl tribe and their conflict with the Danes, and of course, Ermenlaf and his worn boot, the wolf and the ivory comb. And you yourself have certainly heard enough stories about the wooden bowl of unlucky Hygd of the golden hair, and could tell the stories about what happened to her on her 20th name day as well as I. Naturally, I need not spend any of our time telling you about Hrogar, as you have known about his exploits, and what he did at the smithy and the tragic result of it all, since you were no taller than my belt. The stories are endless, and just like real life, none of them ends happily. Screaming in blood we are born, screaming in blood we die. The bravest of us do not scream, but we all bleed and we all die in the end. It is what we do in the time between, and who we kill, that makes all the difference. The story of Beowulf takes place not too long ago, when things were not much different from how they are today. People had regular, normal, everyday names just like we do. Healfdene, Hrothwulf, and Olgentheow being as popular then as they are today. They spoke more or less as we speak still. Like now, folks were always trying to create peace, knowing all the while that peace never lasts. People love to get drunk on mead and ale in long high halls just as they do now, telling stories of heroics in battle just like we do. Then, as now, there was always someone killing someone over something that only seems at all important to people who have been drinking. Families had trouble getting along, and young men kept their swords sharper than their wits and their ale mugs full. Many claimed to be Christian, but saw to their charms and runes and the phase of the moon and listened to their grandmother's stories the same as you and I. Just like today, if someone ended up killing you, it would most likely be your brother. The very first thing most people ever heard about Beowulf at the time was that he was a strong but clumsy young man. Even when he had not been at the mead, he often said the wrong thing, the honest, blunt truth, and he could not be taught the subtleties of fancy sword work, though Hygelac insisted his most skillful thanes try and teach his sister's son the art of battle. In fact, Beowulf was known for throwing, dropping, bending, and outright breaking most of the old swords they normally used to teach young men how to fight, and there was no use giving him a waster practice sword of stout oak or hickory, as he'd soon shatter that to splinters. But when young Beowulf got a certain look in his eye and rushed at you, no matter how good you were with a sword, you knew you had better run before he got you in his grasp. A spear was a better choice to try to keep him at a distance, but if you let him get his hands on the shaft, he would usually bat it aside or roughly knock it flying from your best two-handed grip or shatter it to matchsticks in the grasp of one hand. As he did this, he would lay hold on you with the other hand before pulling you into a crushing bear hug. Beowulf liked fighting, but he had no patience for weapons practice. Besides fighting and drinking mead, Beowulf loved to swim. He could hold his breath underwater for far longer than seemed human, and he could swim off into the distance and explore islands and coastlines one normally needed a ship and favorable winds to reach. When Beowulf had just about finished growing, he and his friend Breca had a glorious summer when each sought to outdo the other at absolutely everything. Breca could beat Beowulf in a foot race and in playing the lute, which Beowulf could not master at all, and Beowulf could beat Breca at wrestling and climbing trees. Both were extremely powerful swimmers, living as they did by the sea and loving to wrestle with the powerful surf. One day, the sea was far too rough for swimming in. A storm looked likely, and both young men were warned that if they stupidly went swimming and drowned, on their own heads it would be. So, being young men with something to prove, they decided to do it anyway, that it really was the very best idea either of them had ever had. They knew they could both swim for a day entire, crossing channels between their own shore and ones out of sight over the horizon, and they knew that they were just as at risk of attack by dangerous sea creatures as they were of drowning. But they were young, and they'd just been warned that it was too dangerous, and so they did it immediately. When you say the word dangerous to a young man, he often hears you say the word exciting instead. Now, it is not of course unheard of for a man to swim a channel or a strait and not stop until the same time the next day, but Breca and Beowulf, swimming side by side, wearing war blades in case of shark attack, swam for 2, then 3 days. By the 4th day, it was clear that Beowulf was the stronger swimmer. On the 5th day, Breca fell enough behind that in some crashing surf Beowulf lost track of him entirely and could not find him again. Breca was carried by the waves to a distant outcropping of land, and as for Beowulf, he got swept up in currents that eventually took him to the coast of Finland, where exhausted, he emerged from the sea scraped and bleeding, sword in hand and wild tales on his lips asking for mead. It was the best summer ever.